All right, I think we can go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to this online workshop on using secondary analysis for dissertation projects. My name is Maureen Haaker, and I've worked with the UK Data Service for over 10 years now, specializing in qualitative data, but working on everything from ingesting and curating qualitative data to reusing it in reuse projects. And I'm here with my colleague, Alle. Did you want to introduce yourself?
Hi everyone, I'm Ali Bloom. I work as part of the training and user support team at the UK Data Service. I create a lot of our online training resources, including ones specific for dissertation and research students. So great to have you all here today.
So what we're planning to do today is to go over what secondary analysis is, look a little bit closer at some of the key methodological issues of reuse projects for both qualitative and quantitative data. Before we get knee deep in that, I am going to just go through what is the UK Data Service, just for those of you who've not had the pleasure yet of exploring the archive. I've tried to pull in a few case studies as well, so that you can see some of our data in action. And then we're going to end by signposting you to some further resources, which can help if you're planning a reuse project. This is an introductory workshop, so we've assumed that most of you have probably not used the archives before and may have only had introductory modules to research methods. So before we get too far along, I just want to address a simple point first, which is what is secondary analysis? So in short, secondary analysis is a method which is asking new questions of old data. So it's analyzing data that you've not yet, that you haven't collected yourself. So usually researchers collect far more data than they actually need to answer their own research questions. So if you think of, for example, national surveys, which collect a lot of data on a representative sample, or qualitative studies, which will have, conduct things like interviews that may last 2 hours, sometimes more. Those data sets can actually answer a lot of different research questions, and they can be analyzed using different techniques. So secondary analysis makes use of that data, and it does just that. It's reusing the data that's been collected by someone else. But there is a complicated nuance here around terminology. So you might have heard of other terms to describe the method, including secondary data analysis or reuse projects. And all of these are referring to, more or less the same method. So don't get confused by this. But there is a little bit of an ongoing debate about how to call this method. So in 2007, Libby Bishop wrote this article on the primary secondary dualism. And basically, she was making the argument that there may be a privileging of methods where you go out and collect data yourself. And using terms like secondary analysis or secondary data reinforces that hierarchy. But actually, primary and secondary analysis are a lot more similar than different if you fully considered the key methodological issues of secondary analysis as a method. Consequently, you'll find an increase of the use of the term data reuse, and that's a term that I generally tend to use and I'll probably use throughout this workshop. And it basically just takes into account the huge range of ways that data can be used and reused, and it doesn't imply that any of those projects are secondary to the initial use of the data. You can use whatever term comes to mind first, but do be aware there's a few different ways of describing this process of reusing data. So you can see here, even within the article, she's used a lot of different terminology. Okay, so you know what secondary analysis is, but where would you find data that's already been collected? And this is where the UK Data Service, which holds the largest collection of social science data in the UK, comes in. It's a comprehensive resource that is funded by the ESRC. Our main job is to be a single point of access to a wide range of secondary social science data. So the main purpose then is the collection, the ingest, and the processing of that data, and the further dissemination of that data for people to use. So in addition to that data infrastructure core, we also have a service layer which provides extensive support, training, and guidance. Who is it for? We like to think it's really for anyone who has an interest in data. Traditionally, our main audience and the people who probably both deposit and use our data the most tend to be academic researchers and students. There are a lot of other groups that are well represented, including government analysts, charities, foundations, businesses, research centers, and think tanks all give us and use our data. And given the importance of data and how it's used and how it's disseminated, we are trying to reach out and support a wide range of communities. What kinds of data do we hold? The majority of the data, at least judging by the number of collections, is certainly going to be quantitative data. So we hold thousands, over 8,000 collections, of which the vast majority of those are quantitative collections. But we do hold a wide variety of that data. So there's survey data, which is both cross-sectional and longitudinal. We have aggregate statistics, domestic, international macro data, census data and microdata. And then, of course, we also have a large collection of qualitative data. Where does it come from? Again, that varies depending on the data type. And some of the sources that you see here, including the agencies in the statistical time series, those clearly are the main sources for quantitative data. Most of our qualitative and mixed data comes through individual academics through their research grants. And of course, we also hold some originally paper-based public records and historical sources, including things like the census. And where can you find information about the archive and the service? We have a website, ukdataservice.ac.uk, which holds a lot of information. And from there, you can find our data catalog. And we also have hundreds of pages which discuss methodological issues like gaining consent, anonymizing data, storing data, so on and so forth. There's also student-specific tutorials. So we have a set of data skills modules. We also have workbooks and exercises that are based off of collections that we hold. There's also a help page if you have a specific question about how to use the website. But back to dissertation projects. What kind of research projects can you do reusing data from an archive? Well, we really need to go back to the beginning to answer this and think about the research process as a whole. So you're hopefully familiar with this model. It starts with some kind of topic or general direction for your research. You then do some background research into the literature already written on your topic. And then from there, hopefully you're inspired to ask a research question which will build on that body of research. And once you've got your research question, you then decide the best way to answer that question and design a project. And once you've got your methods, you then just collect the data, analyze it, and begin your write-up, which is what you would normally submit for your dissertation. You might have a few extra steps in there. You might swap a couple of those steps depending on your theoretical foundation, but generally speaking, this is normally how we think of the research process. When you're doing a project using secondary analysis, however, this process looks different. The model clearly shows how the research question is built on your chosen topic area and your preliminary search, possibly some literature that you find. However, with secondary analysis, the research question is derived directly from the data. So you start with a topic that you're interested in, but instead of looking for literature, you look for data and you start evaluating those collections. When you find a collection that intrigues you, you then ask a question, a research question of the data. From there, you would then find out what literature exists on that particular topic or on that question. And then, of course, you don't need to collect the data. You just need to access it, which is one of the key advantages of secondary analysis. The data is already collected, so you just need to get your hands on it, either by downloading it from our data catalog page, or you may need to actually go to the archive if it's only available in paper form. Once you have it, you then analyze it and you can write up your dissertation. So the key point I'm trying to make here is around reusing data, for dissertation projects, is about where you get your research question from. It would take a lot of time and a lot of, inside knowledge about the data that already exists within the archive in order to be able to come up with a research question and then find the perfect data to answer it. You'd be searching for that perfect data for a really long time unless you already have a good working knowledge about the collections that are held by the archive. So for a dissertation project, when your time and your resources are limited, you'll want to look for the data first, and then from there develop a research question, which would give a new take on that data. So you can, of course, spend some time looking for some good data first, but for your dissertation project, you may want to look and see what data exists on your general topic area before trying to nail down a specific research question. With that being said, it's probably important to have some kind of idea about what kind of project you might want to do. So while you might be exploring the data without a specific question in mind, you might still want to think about what kind of research design your project will follow. So there's 4 types of reuse projects that will lend themselves well to a dissertation project. And these are reanalysis, replication study, comparative study, or a restudy. So reanalysis is probably the one that comes to mind when thinking about what secondary analysis is. And this involves thinking about the wide range of approaches you can take in the analysis of a data set. And it usually means asking some kind of different research question from what the original researchers were trying to do. So for example, Clive Seal and Charteris Black did a study using comparative keyword analysis of illness narratives. Now, the original illness narratives had been looked at exclusively for health research, so the interviews were meant to explore how diagnoses are made. When Seal and Charteris Black came along to do the comparative keyword analysis, however, they were much more interested in analysis of the discussions between the patients and the doctors rather than the actual health issues that came up in the interviews. So the question can be very different in that kind of way. Or sometimes the question can be on a similar topic to the original research, but have a slightly different focus. So for example, Joanna Bornat was looking at gerontology as a topic, and she found a couple different data sets that look specifically at gerontology. However, Bornat's research question was on racism, which wasn't the specific focus of the original work, but those data sets were rich enough to allow her to explore that theme within the existing data. If you want to use the exact same analysis strategy, that would be a replication study, and that's also possible. So right now there's a real concern about the reproducibility of research, and replication studies can often reveal the messiness that's involved in working through data. One of the most famous, or rather infamous, examples of replication is from Thomas Herndon, who was a postgraduate student at University of Massachusetts. And he was assigned an assessment to replicate the results from a published study. So he chose Reinhardt and Rogoff's 2010 paper, Growth in the Time of Debt. And basically, this paper came up with the proportion at which your national debt can be of your GDP before you start to see negative economic growth. And Thomas Herndon pulled the OECD data to rerun that analysis, just as the paper had laid out, but he got a completely different answer. The paper that was published said debt cannot exceed 90% of your GDP. Otherwise, you have a negative impact on your economic growth. However, he calculated that the debt can actually exceed your GDP. So he ended up having to contact the original investigators, and he found a flaw in the data set, in the data file, where some cells had been miscopied from the original data that's made available by the OECD. So the full story is published in 2013 in the New Yorker. A replication study hopefully wouldn't always find these kinds of flaws in the original study, but nonetheless, it's a study design that's worth considering, and it helps you develop an appreciation for the research process. You could possibly even develop a project whereby you are rerunning a series of studies on the same topic, or you explore, a really complicated data set where you have to work through, missing data or transforming variables or so on. You can also do comparative work. Um, you might be looking at an international comparison between two countries or just comparing social subgroups of the population based on a shared social characteristic. We've got some key data pages for quantitative data sets, which outline some of the large national surveys that are held at the archive, and any of those would allow you to do some comparative work without having to collect two sets of data. You could compare samples across time, across geographic place, gender, ethnicity. These characteristics are usually collected as a standard for these larger surveys. The final type of reuse is going to be exemplified in a case study that I'll go through with you. And this is a re-study. And this is where you replicate the methods of a study for purposes of comparison. So it does a bit of secondary analysis, but it also allows scope to collect a little bit of your own data. So the example of this kind of reuse project is from the collection School Leavers Study. The original study was conducted by Ray Paul in the late 70s as part of a much wider community study on the Isle of Sheppey. As part of that project, Paul stumbled across some teachers who had set a particular essay just before their students were due to leave school, and it prompted the students to imagine that they were reaching the end of their life, and something made them think back to the time they left school. And they were then assigned to write a short essay of what happened in their life over the next 30 to 40 years. And Ray Paul thought this was a really interesting essay, and he got permission from the schools to take this in as part of his data collection. In 2009, Graham Crow and Don Lyon, and that's Graham Crow there with Ray Paul, who's holding his book Division of Labor, decided to reanalyze that data set, and they wanted to focus solely on student aspirations. So using the very same methodology, they conducted a restudy of school leavers for students on the Isle of Sheppey in 2009. And the prompt that was supplied to students in the 2009-2010 academic year was, nearly the same. Imagine you're at the end of your life and reflect back on what you've done since leaving school. They then transcribed those essays and compared the themes from the new set of essays to the set of essays that were collected by Ray Paul. And you can see the wording of the prompt there, and there's a little snippet on the bottom of what one of those transcribed essays looks like. And the findings are fascinating. They show a difference of young people's aspirations over one generation. 40 years has passed. But how exactly were they different? So in 1978, students expected much more grounded and arguably mundane sorts of jobs. Career progression was gradual and it followed on from hard work. And sometimes there were talks of periods of unemployment or even quite morbidly early death of either themselves or someone they loved. And you can see a few examples in the left column of some of the quotations from those essays, such as the one at the bottom. I longed for something exciting and challenging, but yet again, I had to settle for second best. I began working in a large clothes factory. The later essays, however, showed students imagining well-paid and instantaneous jobs filled with choice, but also with some uncertainty. And Crow and his research team also clearly noted the influence of celebrity culture in those essays. So, for example, you have the quote on the bottom of a girl who writes, "In my future, I want to become either a dance teacher, a hairdresser, or a professional show jumper, horse rider. If I do become a dancer, my dream would be to dance for Beyonce or someone really famous." Now, that study was, a fairly large study and larger than what might be realistic for a dissertation project. So the goal was to engage the community alongside the research and find innovative ways of including the participants in the research outputs. So as part of that initiative, They published the Living and Working on Sheppey website, which I believe is recently defunct, but the idea was to create this kind of shared history and memory of what living on the Isle of Sheppey is like among that community. So while this would be, I think, quite an ambitious project, to say the least, for a dissertation, it's nonetheless a very good example of how you can combine a bit of data collection and a bit of data reuse into one project. So for those of you who might be doing some PhD work, for example, this would certainly be something to consider for your projects. For others, you can design a more feasible study with a smaller sample and smaller outputs. So hopefully you're now budding with some ideas of what you might want to look for in the archives or what kind of project you might be able to do reusing data. And since you are not collecting the data yourself, you'll find that reuse projects have very few ethical considerations comparatively. And hopefully you wouldn't hit too many snags with things like ethical review boards. However, that doesn't mean there aren't any ethical considerations. So there's two key points that I want to make before diving into qualitative and quantitative data. And the first of these starts with the access point. How do you get permission to use the data? So if you're reusing data that's from an established archive like the UK Data Service, we've taken a lot of the pain out of accessing by negotiating some licensing with the person who collected the data. So this usually means that you need to sign what's called the end user license. And this is a legal document which states you're going to do two really important things. And one of them is that you won't share the data onward, and that includes your supervisor. If you need help with the analysis or your supervisor needs to see the data, then they will need to register and download the data for themselves. The end user license stipulates that you cannot, under any circumstance, share your data or your login with anyone else. All of the data that we hold has been anonymized, which again is likely to be the case if you're reusing data from an archive. However, just because it's been anonymized doesn't mean it's completely impossible to ever figure out any identities of participants. So there's some really excellent YouTube tutorials around anonymization theory. In short, it's basically this theoretical point at which that makes the argument that no anonymization strategy would ever be 100% effective. So consequently, the second ethical issue to consider is, should you inadvertently uncover any identities of the participants, then you will not reveal that identity to anyone. It's highly unlikely that would happen, but the end user license basically just makes that stipulation just as a sort of backup in case you do recognize somebody within the data. So those are the key issues that you need to recognize when signing that end user license and when registering with the UK Data Service. Once you have sorted out the access, the second point that I want to make is that you need to ensure that you are citing the data. So in short, citing archive data will help data creators track the impact of their study. It also supports reproducibility. It makes it easier to find the data that you've used for your project. And the issue is really important. So the UK Data Service does have some pages on the website which go into a little bit more detail about the data citation and how, it explain why this is an important ethical issue. We have tried to make this easy for you to cite the data by supplying you with the needed citation directly on the catalog pages. So on the catalog page, you'll see under citation and copyright that there is a box, and you can just literally copy paste that and put it into your reference list. And you can even select the citation style that you want to use. So you've got access, you've sorted out the citation, now comes actually doing secondary analysis. So I'm going to talk through qualitative data first, and there's a couple of key issues in getting started with qualitative data. And then I'm going to pass over to Alle, who's going to talk about quantitative data. So first I'll talk about orienting yourself to the collection and recontextualizing the data, and then I'm just going to make a couple of points about sampling. So when you first download a qualitative data set, you'll get a zipped folder which looks a bit like this. You've got some folders and they're absolutely stuffed with files. Most of the qualitative data is held as what's called an RTF. So to find that data, you just need to go into the folder titled RTF, which is a Word document. So when you open up that folder, you'll probably get something that looks a bit like this. And that's it. That's all your data nicely organized. So clicking on one of those files would open up a data file that would look like this. And this is a snippet of what the school leavers study essays look like in their entirety. So that particular RTF folder has over 100 of those files. But the files don't just have to be essays or interview transcripts. So you might find, for example, PDFs of handwritten notes, like in the upper left corner, or ethnographic notes, like those that are written on the right. Some collections might also have images or videos, like those in the lower left-hand corner. That's a little bit more unusual to see that, but we do have a few collections with those sorts of things. Most likely, you'll end up opening up an interview transcript, like the one that's seen here. So the interview transcript should have clear turn taking and speaker tags. So the turn taking is where you start a new line with a new speaker. And the speaker tags here are titled Q and A so that you know who is speaking. And there's a lot of different types of data available. So make sure you have a good look through the collection first, see what's there and see what it looks like. So the next thing you need to do is to orient yourself to the project. And I think the main point to make here is to not underestimate the amount of time it would take to get acquainted with the data set. There might be multiple levels of context to get through in order to really understand that data. And what I mean by that is you might have more than just the data that's collected at the time of the interview or the data collection. You might also need to consider social characteristics of the participant, or the historical time period in which the data was collected, or perhaps where the data was collected. So really the idea is that you need to understand the data set as a whole in order to really get at the root of what the data can convey. Every collection at the UK Data Service has some documentation provided with the data set, and that will be really useful for that process of recontextualization. So it often contains more information about the methodology. So you might have things like an interview schedule or a call for participants, or sometimes there's segments from publications arising out of the original study, or I've also seen things like funding applications. For qualitative data sets, this documentation is called the user guide. And here's an example of a user guide. This one happens to have an interview guide for interviewers, as well as the consent form, a sample profile, and it's just further background information to help you understand how that data was collected. But what if you want to know about the participants themselves? So every qualitative study also has what's called a data listing. And here's an example of one of these. It's a table which gives a brief overview of the data in the collection. So each row represents a piece of data or even a participant, and each column lists some sort of characteristic or attribute of that interview or piece of data. It's a quick way of getting to know who took part in this study. In addition to the context of the data, you might also have to consider the sample. So for example, if the data set is too large, you might have to take a subsample. Qualitative collections tend to be smaller anyways, but many of the archive data sets are well funded and they can collect a considerable amount of data. So for a small dissertation project, you'll probably want to be realistic and decide if you need to limit the number of participants to a smaller subsample, or if, you know, or if perhaps you want to think about which participants from that collection you actually want to include. I'm thinking right now of one collection, the Edwardians collection, which was put together by Paul Thompson and it's widely considered to be the first oral history of Britain. And it contained 453 80-plus page interviews. Conversely, I'd say many dissertation projects probably have an expectation of maybe around 6 to 10 interviews. So you'd want a clear sampling strategy to help you choose which of those interviews to actually look at. Are you going to whittle it down based on the particular characteristics of the participant, or do you have another sampling strategy? You might also want to combine data from different collections that complement each other. Remember, it would take a lot of time to sift through and find different pieces of data sets to pull together, but it is another possibility if you feel like all the data speaks to the same topic and research question in a harmonious way, and you've done that work of recontextualizing to make sure those interviews work together. Okay, so that's it for qualitative collections. I'm going to pass over to Alle now. Just bear with us while we swap screens around. And she's going to talk about some of the key methodological challenges of quantitative data.
Thanks, Maureen. So you should all be able to see my screen now. Do let us know in the chat if there's any issues there. But yeah, as Maureen said, I'm going to give a quick rundown of the key things you need to consider if you're going to be using quantitative data for your dissertation project. So I'm going to cover the key things you need to consider in two main areas. First of all, what you need to think about when you're selecting your data, and then what you need to think about to get to grips with understanding it. So selecting your data. So we are going to start with a quick poll in Mentimeter. So I just want to know what topics you are interested in looking at for your dissertation. So bear with me while I just pop the poll up. Some of you might already have a clear idea of what you're going to be looking at. Some of you might also still be considering it, but any thoughts you've got, I'll just pop up the poll, and I'm just sort of interested to see what topics we're interested in. So you should be able to join with the code there. I do know that we had a few people who couldn't get onto Mentimeter, so you can also pop your responses in the chat, and I'll be able to have a look at them there. So it looks like we've got a lot of interest in education, social justice, health. We have a lot of health data sets. Health Survey for England is a great one. We've also got things like employment. Yeah, the labour force survey is a great one for that topic. But it really looks like education and employment and health are some of our key topics, as well as ethnicity. So that's great. They actually happen to be some of the theme pages and topics we've got that you can have a look at on the website. So, and I'm just going to have a quick look in the chat. I can see that politics, nutrition, mental health, psychometric assessments. So yeah, it looks like we've got a wide range of topics, but mostly education, employment, and things around race and ethnicity. So, as I said, some of you might already know your topic area, but if not, here's a little bit of an idea of some of the data available and the data sets that cover these topics. So if you're interested in looking at the environment, you may want to have a look at some of the OECD environment statistics that we hold. Like I said, for workforce patterns, the labour force survey is a really interesting survey that would cover that kind of topic. For healthcare, there's the Health Survey for England, the Psychiatric Morbidity Survey, so that's what you'd want to be looking at if you were looking at mental health. And there are youth mental health surveys and also general adult mental health surveys as well, and there's also specific dental health surveys. If you're interested in sort of family finance and family spending, the Family Resources Survey is a great resource for that. If you're interested in police and crime, the Crime Survey for England and Wales covers that. And we also have some different ones as well, things like time use surveys that would allow you to see how people spent their time during the pandemic. And if you're interested in attitudes and political opinions, things like the British Social Attitude Survey or Understanding Society might be useful for your project there. And these are just some examples. We do hold a lot of different data here. If you want a little bit more an idea of the way our data can be used, do have a look at our impact case studies. These are real-world research projects that have been completed using data from our collections, and they cover all different kinds of topics. So that might be a place to start as well. And we also have our specific dissertation case studies. So these are stories from students who have used data in our collections in their projects. So for example, we have Elizabeth, who used the Understanding Society data to identify if there was a relationship between class and the perception of the environmental crisis. And also Rosalind, who looked at how social bonds and social demographic factors affect youth violence. So that might be a good place to sort of get an idea of how the data can be used as well. So why have I started by talking about topic? Well, this is because, as Maureen said earlier, you'd have to know the data sets really very well to find the perfect one to answer your question. So instead, we can think about this as a process of refining our project and questions as we explore the data. So let's say you have a general idea of your topic area and you're starting to think about the data you might use to explore it. A good place to start is by thinking about what you're trying to measure. And this is key for a quantitative reuse project because you need to know the key concepts you want to measure so you can relate these to pre-existing variables within a data set. So, for example, let's say we're interested in looking at the relationship between fear of crime and age. Our key concepts here are fear of crime and age. So we need to find some data which has variables that measure these concepts and will allow us to formulate and answer a research question about them. Because, as Maureen said earlier, it's hard to find the perfect data set, it's easier to start from this broader topic and then derive your key concepts and questions from the existing or available variables. That said, if you do already have a clear question in mind, perhaps from a research proposal assignment or a previous discussion with your supervisor, you can search for data in line with this, but just keep in mind you may have to be a bit flexible and sort of revise it based on what data and variables are available. So now you have a bit of an idea of your topic. There are a few key places you might want to start looking for your data. So like I mentioned earlier, we have our theme pages. You can use these to look for data sets on a theme. You can type keywords into our data catalog. You can use our variable and question bank, which allows you to search for particular variables within data sets, but do be aware that not all of our data sets are covered in there. So it might be that you find a sort of earlier version of a data set, and then you can go and have a look at the later one to check whether the variables are still in that data set. And the Hassett thesaurus, which lets you search by key social science terms. So if you've got a bit of a sort of less tangible concept that you're interested in, you may be able to search for data through that as well. All of these can be found in the Find Data page on the section of the website under Browse and Access Data. And don't worry if this all seems a bit abstract, we will be having a practice in the practical session as well. So we've gone through the search, we've gone through the theme pages, maybe we've clicked on the health theme to find data related to health or crime for data related to crime, and we found a data set that we think might be suitable. So once you've done that, you'll need to consult the catalogue page. This will give you an overview of the key topics, background, and a brief overview of the methodology used to collect the data. You can also access the documentation from here, which Maureen mentioned earlier as well. We have documentation for qualitative data sets and we also have it for quantitative data sets. Quantitative data sets look slightly different. You will have things like technical reports. Most data sets will have a user guide, notes added by the data producers. So for example, if there's been any changes in the weighting or how the data has been defined, that will be included there. And most importantly, for sort of finding your data, the list of variables will be found in the documentation. And where this can be found varies slightly between different data sets, but it's usually found in the user guide or the variable list. And the codebook or data dictionary is another place you can find this as well. And here you'll find information on what the variables measure. The codebook will contain the different categories included under those variables. And it will also give a bit of information on who they apply to, and I'll discuss that a little bit more later. So back to our example, if we wanted data on crime, we might look at the Crime Survey for England and Wales. This is a large, very important survey that may cover our key topics. So the Crime Survey is an important source of information about crime, particularly because it is independent from police records, so it provides another source of crime statistics. It's an example of a repeated cross-sectional survey. It's done every year, and the sample is about 35,000 individuals aged 16 plus and 3,000 people aged 10 to 15. So back to our variables. Say we've sort of had a look at the crime survey for England Wales, and we think, yes, we're going to have a look at using this data. So having a look in the code book, I can see that the crime survey has two variables that might measure our key concepts. Qual life, which asks respondents how much their own quality of life is affected by fear of crime on a scale of 1 to 10, and a measure of the respondent's age. So we've found these variables, but now we need to think carefully about whether they're suitable. An important step is to think critically about what these variables measure. So take a look at our qual life variable. Is this measuring fear of crime, or is it actually measuring how much fear of crime affects life? And with all these variables, this is something you need to think about and consider. What is the question really asking? What question were the respondents asked at the time in the questionnaire? And the original questionnaire can usually be found in the documentation. So that's a great place to start to get a bit of an understanding of the background of the variables that you're using. As well as considering your variables and concepts, you might also want to consider the kind of analysis you want to do or can do with the data. So, for example, if you're interested in looking at individuals at a particular time point, you're going to want to use a cross-sectional survey, like the crime survey for England and Wales, for example. If you want to look at individuals over time, you may want to use longitudinal data. If you are interested in specific small geographic areas, the census data will provide information on that. And if you want to compare countries at a higher level over time, international time series data might be suitable. And information on all the data types is also on our website as well. It's also important that you think about your population. So that's the group that you want to measure. So for example, for our fear of crime, are we interested in the population of the world? Are we interested in the population of the UK, or perhaps a particular city or local authority area? For example, I've put Manchester up here. As well as this, you need to consider your unit of analysis. So are you interested in looking at individual people, or are you interested in looking at households? And this will affect the data you use, as some data sets are only available for particular geographies or only collect data from certain units. Finally, it's important to remember that the process isn't linear, so you may need to go back and forth and realign your question with the available data. You may need to compromise if the perfect data set isn't available, or choose different variables, refine down your question, and this is all part of the process of doing secondary analysis. So I'm going to quickly cover understanding your data now. So once you've chosen your data set, there are a few final things you need to consider. So as I was saying earlier, the documentation usually contains information on the variables, but it should also have information on the questionnaire used to collect the data. As I said, it's really important to understand this process behind the scenes, to understand how the variables were collected. And something that's particularly important is something called routing, which is basically who was asked which questions. This is because many questionnaires use something called computer-aided interviewing, an automatic system which sends respondents through the questionnaire by different routes dependent on their previous answers. So, for example, if we are asking someone their age and they say they are under 18, the questionnaire might route them away from questions about alcohol use or work, because it wouldn't be applicable to them. Therefore, many of the questions in a survey are only applicable to some of the sample, so you're going to need to check the documentation to see who was asked the variables that you're interested in and whether that sort of matches the population you're interested in exploring. So, for example, this is a variable called Flex10 from the Labour Force survey. It relates to special working arrangements. We can see under the bottom here that this question is asked if the respondent is in work. And it also gives information. This sort of complicated codey bit is about the other variables that have been used to define whether this question was asked. It does look a bit confusing, but once you've got your head around it, it does make a bit more sense. And you will find that the documentation looks different across different data, but this gives you a general idea of what to expect. You can also find information about how data has been processed after collection. So you may come across something called derived variables. These are variables that have been created from the raw data. So here is an example of this. So this again is our flex10 variable that we talked about on the last slide. And basically it's been used to derive a variable called flexw7, which measures whether a respondent works 0 hours contracts. This variable has been derived by taking all of those who responded 7 on the flex10 variable, which indicated they worked a 0 hours contract, and then coding them as 1 on the new flexw7 variable, therefore measuring whether they work a 0 hours contract or not. Not all documentation contains these diagrams. In some surveys, it may be the SPSS or status syntax, which shows you how the variables have been derived, but it is really important that you understand the origin of any variables that you are using. Finally, you also need to think about sampling. So surveys and qualitative data sources almost always based on samples. And one important question you need to ask about your data is the sample representative? So you need to know who is included in your sample. Is it adults? Is it only those in private addresses? Has it missed those who are in things like care homes or who might not be registered the same way as everyone else? What was the response rate like? And is there any information about differential response across the population? This will tell you about any potential bias. And you'll also need to know whether you need to apply a weight to make sure the data is representative. And again, all this information will be found in the documentation that comes along with the data, user guides or technical reports. And if you have any trouble finding this, you can get in contact with our help desk and we'll be able to go through this with you as well. One final question you need to ask is whether you have enough cases to make a precise estimate. So for example, the Crime Survey for England and Wales has a large sample size, so it should allow for precise estimates. However, if you were investigating a smaller subpopulation, so for example, if you were only looking at those with disabilities or only those with particular characteristics, you may find that the sample isn't big enough to make precise estimates. I've just given you a general overview about sampling there, but there is more resources on our website as well. So just to summarize, for quantitative data, you need to think about your key concepts, what you're trying to measure, and relate these to variables within a data set. You need to check the documentation. I can't stress this enough. I know I keep going on about it, but it is the most important source of information about any data set that you're going to be using, and it will really help you understand your data. And you need to make sure that you're considering sampling as well. So that's the end of the overview of quantitative data. I'm now just going to quickly run through some of our dissertation resources on the website and where you can find further information to help you with your project. So our student pages on our website can be found by going to Home, Learning Hub, and then Students. They contain information on things like what data is available, how to find and access data, our dissertation awards, and further resources such as worksheets to help you go through and think through the concepts and some of the topics I've covered today. If you also want to get to grips with data sets, we have our Learning Hub and our data skills modules, which will take you through an example of a project or an example of using a data set and help you build up some of those statistical skills as well. In particular, I just want to draw your attention to our finding and accessing data for your project pages. These contain worksheets, videos, and guidance to help you do things like identifying your data needs, so identifying relevant variables and data sets, to search for and evaluate your data and to think about your project. Also, if you are working on a dissertation that has been or will be submitted as part of the 2024-2025 academic year, please consider submitting it for our dissertation award. This award recognises 3 undergraduate dissertations that are on social science topics. uses at least some data from our catalogue and are submitted in the 2024-2025 academic year. Each winner will receive a £300 award, and the deadline is the 18th of June 2025. So do have a search up of that as well, if you think your project might be relevant. If you want to follow our specific dissertation resources and updates, you can follow hashtag UKDS Dissertations on X, formerly Twitter, and Blue Sky for all of our latest updates. So thank you for bearing with us while we talked for so long. And now we're going to move on to the activity part of today's workshop. So we've got some worksheets to help you get started, and then we'll come back together after each activity and share the answers in Mentimeter. So I'm just going to pop the first of these activity worksheets in the chat, and then we should be able to get started. In the meantime, if you have any questions about anything in our presentation, please do pop those in the Q&A box, and Maureen and I will be able to answer those at the end as well. Sorry, there we go. Bear with.
There are questions coming through. I am trying to answer some of them, but I think we'll definitely go through at least some of these answers as well verbally at the end, because there's some really good questions here.
Thanks, Maureen.
And if you have a chance, Ellie, there's one for you to look at when you
Okay, great.
have a moment.
Thanks, Maureen. So you should be able to see my screen share. So this, I've popped the worksheet up in case anyone can't access it in the chat. So this is just to go and have a go at browsing our data catalogue, and then go and have a look at trying to find some data either on a topic that's relevant for you, or have a go at trying some of the examples that we've given there. And we'll give about sort of 5 to 10 minutes, and then we'll come back and feed into Mentimeter on what we found. In the meantime, if you have any issues or questions, like I say, please pop them in the chat, and we'll be able to answer those for you. Okay, so I think everyone should have had a chance to sort of have an exploration of the catalogue, and have a go at that. So if you want to pop back into Mentimeter, and just let me know what data set did you find? Did you find something relevant for your project? Did you find something on one of our lists? And you'll find the Menti code in the chat again there as well. So I'll give a second for everyone to feedback on that. Thanks, Maureen. And I've just popped up on the screen as well. There are more detailed information about search tips, using keywords, because we do also use the European Language Social Science Thesaurus, and there's a little bit of information about tips for searching and refining your project using that as well. So
that's a really good point, actually. The thesaurus is really useful once you have a read about using the thesaurus, because you can use the keywords that are listed on the data catalog page to either find other words that you might not have considered, or that also has a hierarchy of language as well. So you can search for, the broad spectrum of economic, but specifically things that are on, household expenditure or something like that. It'll have a hierarchy so that you can narrow it down that way.
Brill, thank you. And I've just popped back to Mentimeter to see some of the topics that people have found. So I can see that people have found the OECD stats. Those are really useful. The Young Lives survey is really interesting. If you found that, they also did a specific telephone survey during the COVID-19 pandemic that's very interesting and was pretty rapid fire at switching to a new sort of format during the pandemic. So if you're interested in that, that will be super helpful. And see that someone's found 109 different data sets on a topic. That's great. And I'm glad to see someone's found maternity survey data, because I know that someone said that they were interested in that topic in the chat as well. We've found some qualitative interview data as well. Brill. So do carry on exploring that if you want to have a go at that. If not, I'm going to pop up our next task, which is just to have a go at exploring some of that documentation that we talked about. So yeah, for this task, we're going to have a go at just popping to the catalogue page for some of the Understanding Society data and having a little go at finding information on those data sets. Do jot them down or do keep them in mind, because we are going to feedback on Mentimeter and see what you found as well. And then once you've done that, feel free to go straight on to part 2, which is to have a go at exploring the catalogue documentation for a mixed methods, so qualitative and quantitative study as well. Yes, yeah. So not all of the reshare data does have actual data files. Yes, sometimes it is just sort of projects, but there should be contact details to sort of get in touch with the researchers who deposited their data with us through that page as well. And if you have any issues, let us know and we'll be able to follow that up for you. So if you've sort of finished up with those tasks, or even if you haven't, if you could pop over, rejoin the Mentimeter with the code, and we'll go through some of those questions. So the first ones are for the Understanding Society COVID-19 teaching data set. Just a bit of context, we do have teaching data sets that exist. This is one of them. They can be found from the Teaching with Data pages from the Learning Hub. These are data sets that have been specifically designed for teaching, so they tend to be cut down versions of larger data sets on topics that we think might be interesting for students, but they come along with simplified documentation, a smaller range of variables, and they just are designed to be easier to use. We also have some open versions of teaching data sets as well. Like I say, easier because students don't need to register to access those. So back to the questions. What is the observation unit for this study? Is it individuals? Is it households or families? Or is it both? So I'll give everyone a minute to answer that. It seems we're all pretty much in agreement. So yeah, the answer is both. This is a screenshot from the catalogue page. Under the coverage and methodology section, you can find all of the key information at a glance. And here we can see, families and households and individuals. So next question, what country does this data cover? Is it England, United Kingdom, England and Wales? Again, everyone seems to be in agreement there pretty much. So yeah, it is the United Kingdom. Again, it can be found in that coverage and methodology section. Sorry, I think that's an error. Oh no, yes, no. What topic examples did you find? So in the documentation, what topics did you find in that guide? Yeah, those are some of them. So volunteering, socio-demographics, health and well-being, social contact, neighborhood cohesion, volunteering. Yeah, health and well-being. Just let a few more answers come in case anyone's typing. I don't want to cut you off. Okay, so yeah, homeschooling. So yeah, this is the list of topics. Can be found there in the user guide. So you can see that there's a list of which topics are covered and also which data sets those are covered in as well, and which data sets they originally came from, whether it's from the cross-sectional data set or the longitudinal one. So now part 2 of this one, the mixed methods study. So what country do these data cover? Someone saying England. England. Okay, let's see. Yep, that's correct. Again, under the coverage and methodology section, England. And what kind of data are these? Are they audio recordings, numerical data, or are they text data? Yeah, so everyone's in agreement. They are text data. So we've got one more task for you all to do. This is exploring a download bundle, which is from one of the qualitative data sets that we hold. So I'm just going to pop this in the chat and I'll pop it up on the screen as well. Maureen, did you want to introduce this task just because it's more related to
Sure.
qualitative stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. So for this one, we do have, it's not very common, but we do have a couple of open data sets. So we're going to ask you to have a look through the download bundle of one of these open data sets. So this does not require you to register in order to access. But if you click on the link there, it'll take you to a catalog page for the Pioneers of Social Research collection. And this was life histories of researchers and academics who, quote unquote, pioneered a particular method within the social sciences. So this was conducted, um, I think it's the project started in the 90s or early 2000s and carried on up until about 2018, 2019. But these were narrative interviews done by Peter Townsend. So, sorry, Paul Thompson. So if you click on that, it'll take you to the catalog page. You can scroll down and you'll see you can download the data. And there's just 4 questions there. It's just to get you looking around the data download bundle. So what I'll do is we'll give you a few minutes to have an explore of the bundle. And then I've got it up on my screen. I can kind of give you a very quick overview of where to look for things and just some highlights from that. Do keep the questions coming if you've got more that come up. I've been trying to answer them. We will still have a few minutes to go through some of these verbally as well, because there are some really good questions in here. But I'll give you a few minutes now to have a look through the bundle. I'm just gonna, hopefully everyone's been able to access the handout there. I'm just gonna put up my screen so that I can just show you around this bundle. So bear with me while I do that. Hopefully everyone's been able to get it open. I'm just conscious of time, and there were just a couple of things we wanted to signpost to you before you all leave. So I just want to go through this really quick. So I mentioned before that the directory, or the folder rather, is probably the term you use, with the data in it, is going to be labeled by the data type. So RTF is a rich text format, and that's what we tend to use with our Word documents. That's considered an archival format. So if you go into the RTF folder, you'll see that you can get the interview transcripts. There's also interview summaries. Some of these transcripts are quite long. I think one of them, and I forget which one it is, but one of these interviews lasted over 12 hours. So Paul Thompson is a very gifted interviewer and can really get people talking. So you've got all of your interviews in one of those folders, and if you wanted the summaries as well, he's summarized those and made them available as well, so you can access the summaries, which are also available in an RTF format. These were also PDF'd, so you can access as a PDF, and you'll see the directory is titled as a PDF. Sorry, my Zoom menu keeps getting in the way. Let me just try and move this so that I can go back. Now, the folder where the documentation sits is the MRDoc folder. It is always titled the MRDoc folder. And within here, you'll be most interested in the PDF format because we've got all of the documents that would form our user guide. So the consent form, the agreements that were made with interviewees. There's also an interview guide and biographies of each of the participants. We've also got a PDF and an Excel version of the data listing. So on the data listing, for example, is where you can find Stanley Cohen. And I'm now trying to remember which interview number he is. If somebody's found it already, if you could pop it in the chat. I want to say number 26, but I'm probably misremembering. But Stanley Cohen will be listed on here. And from there, you can find what his interview ID is. And that will allow you then to go into the RTF folder and find his specific interview. There's also a README file. And I think we often skip over the README file because we're more interested in the documentation and the data. But the final question there is how many interviews were added to the original collection. And if you open up that README file, there's some information about how the data was digitized and the different editions. So you'll find there were, I believe it was 19 interviews that were added to the original data deposit. So it's just a little bit more information about the level of digitization. I know there was a question that came in around data quality. The README file is where you could find a little bit more information about the standard that was used for digitization. So this one was done to an A-star standard, which means that all of the data that's available is that was collected rather is made available digitally, and it's used file formats that meet the archive standards, etc. Okay, so that's the data download bundle, but hopefully that's useful just to get a glimpse at what it is that you're going to be looking at and downloading. We did have just a couple more slides. So Alle, if you don't mind just putting up the slides. So we do have some recent acquisitions, and this is just to give you an idea of the range of things that we try to make available. We do always constantly, literally every day, have new data collections that are available. So it's worth checking back. Even if something wasn't available previously, we might have new collections coming in that might hit on some of the things that you're interested in. But you can see the kind of breadth of things that we get, everything from generational thinking, Gen Z versus millennials, versus boomers. We also get things on hard-hitting issues like addiction, domestic abuse, things that are sometimes a little bit harder to research on. We also have key events, things like Brexit referendum, for example, loads of data on that. And we also have a lot of events that we offer. So please do come along to any of our future events if any of these look of interest. If you want more of an introduction to the UK Data Service, we have that, but we also focus in on key methodological issues like ethical and legal guidance, informed consent, so on and so forth. And if you do want to access some of the potentially disclosive and highly sensitive data sets, like those that Alle was talking about earlier, you would need to do the safe researcher training. So those are usually listed as well if you needed that kind of training to access those sensitive data sets. Okay, and we do have a few further resources just to kind of signpost you to what else is out there. So Timescapes has a working paper series, which is really helpful. There's a bunch of different topics on there about how to get started with secondary analysis. There's also some good publications. If you're looking at qualitative data, Karen Hughes and Anna Tarrant have published the secondary analysis of qualitative data textbook. The last name is Heaton. I think it's Jane Heaton, also has a chapter in the Using Secondary Data in Educational and Social Research, which is really useful if you're doing quantitative data. We also have things like the data skills modules, which you might find useful. And if you are doing primary research, we still have some things for you as well. So if you're looking for some tools and templates, like what should my informed consent look like? What should my participant information sheet look like? We have loads of examples in our documentation, as well as templates that you can use and adapt for your own projects on our pages. And yeah, I think we're wrapping up here. I know there's been people asking about the slides and recordings. All of that is available through our social media pages. So please do check those out. Okay, we have a minute to spare. Hopefully everyone who asked a question has been able to check back on the answers. There have been some really good questions that have come in as well. So do have a look at what other people have asked.
Yeah, thanks everyone. And if you have any more questions, come to you, do have a look at our help pages. We have lots of frequently asked questions there about accessing the data, finding the data. And if there's something particularly you want to know, it'll come through to our team and we'll be able to help you with that as well. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you, everyone. And please don't forget to complete the evaluation survey as well. That'll help us plan for future events. If there's anything in particular you'd like to see us present on, it's always useful getting some ideas from participants as well.